As the early morning sun painted soft gold across the tarmac, Dana Caldwell stepped onto the jet bridge with the quiet confidence of a woman who had built her empire brick by painstaking brick. At 42, she was the CEO of one of the fastest growing tech firms in the country, a visionary who turned a bootstrapped startup into a $500 million powerhouse with poise, brilliance, and relentless drive. Today's flight carried the weight of a $120 million deal, one that would redefine her company's future and cement her legacy in an industry where few women, let alone black women, ever made it to the top. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit and low heels, Dana was the embodiment of calm authority, her laptop tucked neatly beneath her arm, her mind already racing through the details of the upcoming negotiation. Every minute of her schedule had been meticulously planned, from the private airport car to the pre-boarding emails, because success, for her, had never been accidental. It had been earned through sleepless nights, boardrooms filled with doubt, and the unyielding pressure to prove herself in spaces where she was often the only one who looked like her. As she boarded the first-class cabin, offering a polite smile to the flight attendants, she had no idea that within the next hour, her presence, her very existence in the seat of comfort and power, would become the center of an unwelcome confrontation. She placed her bag in the overhead bin and settled into seat 2A, exhaling slowly as she reviewed the latest projections on her tablet. To anyone watching, she was the picture of composure, a woman in command of her destiny. But beneath the surface was a lifetime of silent calculations: when to speak, when to listen, when to stand firm, and when to let slights go unnoticed for the sake of progress. Just as she took a sip from the glass of water handed to her, a sharply dressed man in his 50s appeared in the aisle, glancing at his boarding pass and then back at her with a frown. "Excuse me," he said, voice tight with annoyance, "I think you're in the wrong seat." Dana looked up, confusion flickering briefly in her eyes before she responded, "No, this is 2A. I double-checked." She gestured calmly toward her boarding pass, but the man didn't look. Instead, he huffed, turned to the flight attendant, and repeated his assumption: she must have made a mistake. The attendant, visibly uncomfortable, verified Dana's boarding pass and confirmed her seat assignment, but the moment had already cast a chill in the air. Dana's hands remained steady, her expression unreadable, but inside she felt the familiar sting, not of surprise, but of exhaustion. Not again. Not here. Not after everything she had accomplished. The man muttered something under his breath as he took his own seat across the aisle, but Dana didn't flinch. She had learned, long ago, that grace under fire wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. She returned to her tablet, not out of ignorance, but out of defiance, the quiet kind, the powerful kind that refused to let someone else's disbelief steal her focus. Yet, for a moment, her thoughts drifted. How many times had she walked into a room only to be mistaken for an assistant, the help, or someone who didn't belong? How many times had she endured the double takes, the second guessing, the patronizing comments coded in civility? She had become fluent in translating tone, in recognizing the coded language of exclusion, and still, she had risen. Not in spite of it but through it. The hum of the engines grew louder, the plane preparing for takeoff, and Dana centered herself once more. The deal awaiting her in New York required clarity, strength, and strategy, none of which could be compromised by the fragile ego of a stranger unwilling to accept her presence. She reminded herself of the young girls who looked up to her, the staff she mentored, the community she supported with her success. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. As the plane lifted off the runway, Dana stared out the window, the city shrinking beneath her, and allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had earned every inch of the seat, earned it in conference rooms, in late-night coding sessions, in every barrier she'd broken and every no she'd turned into a path forward. And though the world hadn't caught up yet, though moments like this reminded her how far there was to go, she wasn't going anywhere. Not today. Not ever. The moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, the air around him shifted, not because of the luxury or the hushed tones of privilege, but because of the way the flight attendant's eyes paused on him, her expression flickering with the kind of surprise that was too quick to be polite and too deliberate to ignore. The CEO, tall and composed in a tailored charcoal gray suit, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to occupying spaces like this, not out of arrogance, but from years of hard work that had taken him from modest beginnings to boardroom victories. Yet, despite his poise and the unmistakable seat number printed clearly on his boarding pass, the attendant approached with a strained smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the corners of her mouth tight, her posture just a touch too stiff. "Excuse me, sir," she said, the words wrapped in syrupy professionalism, but underneath was a clear undercurrent of doubt. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her tone was careful, but the message was unmistakable. It wasn't really a question, but a judgment disguised as courtesy. He looked up at her, calm but alert, the boarding pass still in his hand, as if proof of his right to exist in that plush leather seat needed to be displayed like a passport to belonging. "Yes," he replied evenly, the weight of practiced composure behind the single word, but she hesitated, eyes flicking once more from his dark skin to the gold-embossed seat number, then back to his face, as if trying to reconcile two conflicting images. Around them, the other passengers, already reclined with champagne flutes and noise-canceling headphones, barely noticed the tension simmering between them, but for him, it pulsed with familiarity. He'd felt it in luxury hotel lobbies, behind the wheels of high-end rental cars, in silent elevator rides where he was mistaken for someone else, not by accident, but by assumption. "I just want to make sure," she continued, a hollow smile accompanying her words, "we've had a few mix-ups before." The pause before mix-ups was deliberate, like a soft tap on the shoulder that felt more like a shove. He could have answered sharply, reminded her that his name was printed in bold letters on the manifest, or that his miles with this airline outnumbered most, or even that his company's stock had just been featured in a major business journal, but he didn't. Instead, he met her eyes with a gaze that held back the storm, one forged in years of restraint, and said, "I believe you'll find everything is in order." There was a beat of silence, an invisible tug of war in the air, her authority wrapped in bias meeting his dignity wrapped in silence. She blinked, then turned away without apology, retreating behind the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the world, but the bruise of the moment lingered. He settled back into his seat, but not into comfort, because the luxury around him suddenly felt like it came with conditions tied not to money or miles, but to the assumptions etched into the way people looked at him. He had earned this place, yet he was being asked without words to justify it. That subtle hostility, that questioning of his presence, wasn't about airline policy or seating errors, it was about the narrow box some still tried to confine him in, the quiet disbelief that someone who looked like him could belong among the elite. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had built companies, mentored young leaders, sat on global panels, and yet here, at 35,000 feet, he was once again being asked to prove he belonged. He thought briefly of his mother, who had once worked double shifts to keep the lights on, of the nights he spent studying in borrowed libraries, of every boardroom where he had walked in as the only one who looked like him. He thought of the young people watching, the ones who would someday take these seats and feel what he felt now. So, he stayed calm, not because it didn't hurt, but because dignity had become his form of resistance. The flight continued, the champagne came around, and the hum of the engine soon lulled the cabin into quiet conversation and sleep, but the moment had already done its work. It had revealed how prejudice doesn't always shout, sometimes it speaks in carefully chosen words and tightly drawn smiles. Yet even so, in that tension-filled moment, the CEO chose not to shrink, not to snap, but to remain undiminished, unshaken, and unmistakably present. Because sometimes, the most powerful response to being doubted is to stay seated, head high, proving without saying a word that you do, in fact, belong. On an early morning flight bound for the coast, where tired eyes met crumpled newspapers and steaming paper cups of coffee, a tension began to rise that would soon cut through the quiet hum of the cabin like a sudden gust of wind. It began subtly, as these things often do, with a disagreement over a seat, a mistake in the booking, a misunderstanding, something that could have easily been resolved with patience and grace, but instead, it spiraled into a moment that would leave every passenger on board holding their breath. The woman at the center of the storm was no ordinary traveler. She was a CEO, dressed impeccably in a designer blazer, her presence sharp and commanding, the kind of person who expected the world to move around her rather than the other way around. When the flight attendant gently explained that she was seated in the wrong row and would need to move to accommodate another passenger, the CEO's reaction was swift and cutting, her voice rising with disbelief, then indignation, and finally outrage, as she refused to budge, demanding to see a supervisor, questioning the staff's competence, and insisting that her status entitled her to stay exactly where she was. The cabin, once filled with idle chatter and the rustling of seat belts, fell into a strained silence, heads turning discreetly while eyes flicked back to unread magazines and glowing phone screens, pretending not to notice what they could all feel: the heat of humiliation beginning to bloom across the CEO's face, masked poorly by her anger. Among the passengers, reactions varied. Some watched with barely concealed judgment, others with quiet discomfort, and a few with sympathetic glances toward the young flight attendant who stood her ground with admirable calm, repeating the airline's policy in a voice both professional and unwavering, her hands folded in front of her, her stance firm but respectful. The CEO, unused to being challenged, especially in public, seemed almost stunned by the resistance, as though the very idea of being corrected in front of strangers was a wound to her authority. And when a senior crew member finally arrived and, after reviewing the manifest, politely but firmly asked her to move, the final blow landed not in the request itself, but in the simple, irrefutable fact that she was wrong. The CEO's protest faltered, her eyes scanning the faces around her, now unable to ignore the collective presence of silent witnesses, and for the first time, her voice dropped, not out of understanding, but out of necessity, cornered not by rules, but by the weight of her own ego. With visible reluctance, she gathered her things, her movements sharp and mechanical, the rustle of her belongings loud in the muted space, and made her way to her assigned seat further back in the cabin, her heels clicking like punctuation marks on her pride. No one clapped. No one jeered. But the silence spoke volumes. It wasn't triumph anyone felt, it was discomfort, the shared realization that authority doesn't always equal righteousness, and that power, when wielded without humility, can crumble in the most ordinary of places. The flight attendant, now flushed with the quiet tension of her own, returned to her duties, her professionalism intact, though her eyes betrayed the emotional toll of the moment, a mixture of anxiety, resolve, and the lingering sting of public confrontation. Somewhere near the back, the CEO sat stiffly, staring out the window, the clouds beyond offering no consolation, only reflection. Perhaps in that stillness, among strangers, and at 30,000 feet, she confronted something more uncomfortable than being asked to move, the awareness that respect is not given because of position, but earned through the way one responds when challenged. and while the moment would pass, absorbed by the routine of safety announcements and cabin lights dimming, it would linger in memory, a quiet reckoning not just for her, but for everyone who had watched, unsure of what to feel, and perhaps realizing that grace in the face of inconvenience reveals far more about a person than any title ever could. In the polished, high-rise boardroom where glass walls and modern furniture gave the illusion of transparency and progress, the CEO, an accomplished, poised African-American woman, took her seat at the long mahogany table, prepared for another day of leading with clarity and purpose. But as she slid her chair slightly forward, something unfamiliar caught her eye, a faint label affixed beneath the seat cushion, barely visible but unmistakably intentional. She leaned down, and her breath caught. Printed in small, typed letters were the words, African American. Special case. Sensitive. For a moment, time seemed to stall, the hum of conversations around her fading into a distant blur as her mind tried to process the weight of what she had just seen. It wasn't a simple mistake or a forgotten internal note, it was a label, literal and symbolic, carrying the quiet violence of a system that still saw her not as a leader, not as a mind or a force, but as an exception, as other, as someone whose identity warranted caution or scrutiny. Her fingers grazed over the label, a chill running through her spine, not from fear, but from the sharp sting of recognition. This was not ignorance, this was classification. She straightened slowly, the composure in her body hiding the storm swirling beneath. Around her, her colleagues continued their small talk, oblivious or pretending not to notice, as if the seat and its damning label were invisible. But it wasn't. It was there, clear and cruel, reducing her to a case rather than a colleague. A silence began to spread, not from her voice, which remained steady, but from the undeniable energy shift in the room. A few others had noticed her pause, and then her stillness, and then the faint trace of the label now peeled halfway from the chair. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Some glanced briefly, curious but unwilling to engage. And a very few met her eyes, shame flickering in their expressions like smoke rising from something smoldering quietly for far too long. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to. Her silence, her posture, the quiet tension in her jaw, all of it said more than any outburst could. She had worked too hard, built too much, climbed too high to be reduced to this. Not after the years of being the first in the room, the only in the room. Not after the quiet battles fought behind smiles, the second guessing of every word spoken in meetings, the endless tightrope walk between being assertive and being labeled angry. This label, placed on her chair like a footnote to her presence, was a betrayal, proof that even in spaces she led, the shadow of prejudice still lingered in the corners. And yet, she did not falter. Instead, she stood, slowly, deliberately, and peeled the label off the chair with the kind of grace that makes people uncomfortable, grace rooted in defiance, in pain, in pride. She held the label in her hand for a moment, not to wave it or shame anyone publicly, but to look at it directly, for herself. To refuse the luxury of denial. I assume, she said, her voice calm but resonant, cutting through the room with the elegance of a well-drawn line, that this was meant as some kind of internal note. A guideline, perhaps. A reminder. She paused, letting her words hang like weighted silk. Let this serve as your new reminder, I don't need labels to manage who I am in this room. I earned my place here. I built this place. The silence now was complete, heavy, reverent. No one interrupted. No one dared. Her presence filled the room not with anger, but with undeniable authority. And in that moment, the air seemed to shift, the walls of the glass boardroom suddenly more reflective than transparent, revealing not just her strength, but the quiet complicity of the space around her. One staff member, a younger woman seated near the corner, lowered her eyes, fighting tears not from guilt, but from recognition, from the ache of seeing someone name a truth she had too often swallowed. Another executive leaned forward slightly, unsure of what to say, the weight of years of silence pressing against his chest. But she didn't need their words. She needed their change. Without drama, without raising her voice, she folded the label, placed it gently in the center of the table like an offering no one could ignore, and sat down again, this time, with no label beneath her, and a new, undeniable layer of power around her. The meeting began, eventually. Business moved forward. But something had shifted forever. She had turned a moment of quiet degradation into one of graceful defiance. And everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, knew they had witnessed something rare and necessary, the strength of a leader who did not allow herself to be defined by a system's quiet prejudice, but who rose dignified, unwavering, and unafraid to redefine the room around her. The tension in the room was thick enough to silence even the most casual of whispers, yet she remained still, composed, controlled, and frighteningly calm as the tirade continued in front of her, the man across the table pacing with the self-importance of someone too used to being obeyed and too arrogant to realize he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Eyes flicked nervously around the boardroom, employees shrinking into silence, no one daring to interrupt the spectacle as the man's voice grew louder, more aggressive, believing foolishly that his title and volume granted him immunity, but she, the CEO, watched with an unwavering gaze, not rattled, not flinching, her stillness a quiet contrast to the chaos he created. Inside her, emotion simmered, a complex current of anger, disappointment, and deep resolve, not because this outburst was new, but because it was familiar, too familiar, a toxic pattern she had allowed to go unchecked for too long in the name of results, loyalty, or compromise. But something was different now. Perhaps it was the way her team sat frozen, their discomfort palpable, their eyes begging for someone to draw the line, or maybe it was the finality she felt in her own bones, the deep knowing that leadership meant more than profits and numbers. It meant creating a culture of respect, safety, and accountability. So, without raising her voice or letting emotion distort her expression, she reached silently for her phone, her fingers steady as she opened her contacts and selected a number without hesitation, her voice cool and precise as she spoke, the weight of her words slicing through the air with more impact than all his yelling combined. "Hi, I need legal and HR on a call immediately. Termination clause, effective today. I want it handled by the book. Full documentation, full exit protocol. Also, let's prepare a company-wide statement on standards of conduct. We're resetting expectations." The room fell into stunned silence, the aggressor suddenly frozen mid-sentence, the authority in her voice hitting him harder than any shouted rebuttal ever could, because it wasn't just a response, it was a decision, final and absolute, a moment of leadership born not from anger, but from clarity, conviction, and moral responsibility. In that moment, she didn't just protect her team, she redefined what it meant to lead them, showing them that power wasn't loud or reactive, but thoughtful, ethical, and fiercely protective of those who couldn't speak for themselves. As she ended the call and placed her phone gently back on the table, she met his stunned silence with a calm that carried the full weight of consequence, her voice quiet but unshakable as she said, "You don't get to speak to people that way, not here, not anywhere." And with those words, she didn't just dismantle his position. She dismantled a culture of fear that had lingered too long in the corners of their success. Around her, her team sat straighter, breaths held moments before now exhaled with quiet relief, and in their eyes, she saw something shift, not just respect, but trust, a collective recognition that they were finally, truly seen and protected. She had not lashed out, had not matched fury with fury, but had delivered justice with precision and unwavering integrity, the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself because it is felt in the silence that follows, in the space it clears for others to finally breathe freely. It would have been easy to let it slide, to speak in private, to smooth things over for the sake of appearances, but she knew better now, knew that silence could be complicity and that neutrality, in the face of abuse, was a luxury no real leader could afford. This decision wasn't just about him, it was about every woman who had sat through belittlement to keep her job. Every junior employee who had swallowed mistreatment in the name of ambition, every unheard voice that had been too afraid to speak, and as she looked around at her team, some blinking back tears, others simply nodding in silent appreciation, she knew she had done the right thing, not the easy thing, and in doing so, she had turned a moment of discomfort into a statement of values, a declaration that respect wasn't optional and decency wasn't negotiable. And though the room eventually emptied and the noise returned to the rest of the world, that single decision echoed far beyond the four walls of that boardroom, reshaping culture, restoring dignity, and setting in motion not just the end of one man's influence but the beginning of a safer, stronger, and more just way forward. At 38,000 feet in the sky, surrounded by the muted hum of jet engines and the rustle of in-flight service, she sat upright in her seat, composed, powerful, but quietly burning with the kind of fire only injustice can ignite, her tailored suit immaculate, her expression unreadable to most, yet behind her calm eyes was a decision that would soon send shockwaves through boardrooms and headlines alike. Moments earlier, she had witnessed something that cut through the polite veil of business-class luxury, a flight attendant, young, respectful, professional, being openly belittled by an executive from the very airline she was negotiating with, a man who had no idea who she was. He had barked orders, mocked her accent, and laughed condescendingly when she apologized for a delay outside her control. The scene was brief, easily dismissible by those who had grown too comfortable with power, too numb to decency. But not her. She watched it unfold with rising discomfort, her fingers tightening around the leather armrest, her chest filling with the quiet, simmering weight of moral clarity. For months, she had led the negotiations, a $120 million deal with the airline that would redefine their logistics network and boost profits across 3 continents. She had worked late nights, missed holidays, and carefully managed egos to bring this to the finish line. And yet, in the space of a few cruel minutes, she knew what she had to do. As the executive leaned back smugly in his seat, already unaware of the damage he had done, she quietly reached for her phone. The cabin lights dimmed, but her screen lit up like a beacon of resolve. With a few swift motions, she opened a secure line to her company's headquarters. The line clicked, her assistant answered. "Freeze the airline deal," she said clearly, her voice steady but sharp with conviction. "All $120 million of it?" "Indefinitely." There was a stunned pause on the other end. This wasn't just business, this was legacy. "Are you sure?" came the tentative reply. She looked toward the attendant, now quietly wiping down a tray table, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, yet still smiling through it with the grace of someone who had learned to wear resilience like armor. "I've never been more sure," she said, her gaze unwavering. Around her, the cabin slowly grew silent, as if sensing the gravity of her decision. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others tried not to look, but the moment hung thick in the air, alive with unspoken reckoning. She knew what it meant, the fallout, the angry shareholders, the endless questions from press and peers who would say she had let emotion interfere with business. But what they wouldn't understand, what they never seemed to understand, was that this wasn't about emotion. It was about principle. It was about refusing to align her company's values with a partner who treated human beings like lesser things when no one was watching. It was about the dignity of work and the unseen, often unspoken worth of every person, regardless of title, status, or uniform. She thought of her own mother, once a waitress who endured years of disrespect while putting herself through night school. She thought of every junior employee she had mentored, every underdog she had championed, every time she had said that values weren't just branding, they were the blueprint. This was her moment to prove it. When she ended the call, there was no fanfare, no dramatic announcement. Just a quiet exhale, and a deep, grounded certainty that she had done the right thing. The executive 2 rows ahead glanced back at her, unaware still of who she was, of what had just shifted beneath his feet. Let him stay unaware, she thought. Let him live a little longer in the illusion that power excuses cruelty. She would not correct him. The world would. As the flight continued its smooth path through the night sky, she leaned back in her seat, not to rest, but to reflect. Not on the lost contract, but on what had been gained, a reaffirmation that leadership was not just about expansion, but about protection, not just about vision, but about values. She sipped her tea slowly, watching the stars blink outside the window, and felt a calm pride settle into her bones. Somewhere far below, cities pulsed with life, empires rose and fell, and the wheels of commerce turned ceaselessly, but up here, in the stillness of altitude and integrity, one woman had chosen dignity over dollars, and the world, though it didn't know it yet, had shifted ever so slightly for the better. At first, there was silence, the kind that stretches uncomfortably through narrow aisles and over plastic tray tables, as passengers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to intervene or retreat into the safety of their own routines. But then, as the woman's voice broke through again, calm but undeniably firm, something shifted in the air. She wasn't yelling, wasn't hysterical, just asking for dignity, for fairness, for the kind of treatment that any traveler, any human being, should be entitled to receive. Her presence alone standing her ground in the face of dismissive tones and cold, procedural responses from the airline staff became a mirror for everyone watching, reflecting their own past moments of silence, of compliance, of regret. 1 row back, an older man adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his voice steady as he said, "She's right, you know." His words landed like a pebble dropped into still water, rippling outward, emboldening others. A young woman across the aisle, her earbuds still hanging loosely from one ear, nodded and added, "It's not okay to treat people this way." Another passenger, a mother traveling with her son, quietly offered the woman a bottle of water, her eyes full of empathy and quiet solidarity. The flight attendants hesitated, clearly caught off guard not just by the original complaint, but now by the growing murmur of support surrounding it. This wasn't just one unhappy customer anymore, it was a collective reckoning. Even those who didn't speak watched with newfound attentiveness, their scrolling paused, their reading forgotten, as they re-evaluated what they were seeing. Some looked shocked, not necessarily at the woman's courage, but at how easily the airline had defaulted to defensiveness rather than compassion, how common it suddenly seemed. It wasn't just about seat assignments or policies anymore, it was about how people are seen or not seen when systems forget their humanity. One teenager whispered to his father, "Why are they treating her like she's the problem?" The father didn't respond right away, just kept watching, his face etched with a mix of concern and realization. Somewhere near the back, a woman in business attire pulled out her phone, not to film the incident, but to type out an email draft to the airline, her fingers moving with quiet purpose. She'd traveled for years, seen too many incidents brushed aside, and for the first time, she felt compelled to say something. Amid the rising voices and quiet acts of allyship, the woman at the center of it all stood a little straighter, not emboldened by anger but by the sudden awareness that she wasn't alone. Her message had struck a chord not because it was loud, but because it was true. And truth, when spoken with clarity and calm conviction, has a way of shaking people awake. The staff, visibly flustered now, conferred near the galley, glancing nervously toward the front of the plane. There was no PR script for this moment, no easy fix. It was too late for rehearsed smiles and hollow apologies. The moment had become too real, too honest. What started as tension had transformed into reflection, each passenger, in their own way, asking, "Have I stood up when it mattered? Have I stayed quiet when I should have said something?" Even those who remained silent now bore expressions not of detachment, but of contemplation. In that cramped, fluorescent-lit cabin, a rare kind of unity had formed, not the forced camaraderie of delayed flights or shared complaints, but the fragile, necessary bond of collective conscience. It wasn't about politics, or status, or entitlement, it was about decency. A basic, human decency that everyone hoped to receive, but rarely expected to defend. As the crew finally returned, this time with softened eyes and more measured words, the woman was offered a quiet apology, her seat corrected without further confrontation. There was no grand announcement, no sweeping gesture. Just a quiet resolution, prompted not by outrage, but by empathy. As she sat back down, heart still racing beneath a composed exterior, several passengers offered brief nods, smiles, or murmured affirmations, not to celebrate defiance, but to acknowledge truth. And as the flight resumed, and the familiar hum of engines once again became the soundtrack of the journey, something remained different in the cabin. Something had settled. Not just relief, but awareness. The kind that lingers. The kind that makes people a little more attentive next time, a little more willing to speak up, a little more unwilling to look away. The kind that changes not just the course of a flight, but the character of those on board. It wasn't until the cabin had settled, the door sealed, and the engines began to roar that the weight of their actions started to settle over the flight crew like a quiet, suffocating fog. In the rush and routine of pre-boarding, they had dismissed her, brushed past her questions, spoken over her words, offered clipped tones in place of courtesy, their assumptions cloaked in the subtle armor of practiced professionalism. She had stood there calmly, with grace they did not yet understand, her boarding pass in hand, her posture unshaken, her silence more telling than any outburst could have been. To them, she was just another passenger, difficult, perhaps, or demanding, as they sometimes muttered amongst themselves, but now, seated in the galley with only the hum of the plane and their own conscience for company, pieces of the truth began to surface. A colleague had finally connected the dots, her name, her quiet poise, the unmistakable familiarity that had nagged at them since she stepped on board. She wasn't just any traveler, she was someone significant, someone whose voice carried weight, someone who had built her name on justice, on equity, on standing firm when the world tried to silence her. And they had silenced her. Not with words, but with condescension, with disregard, with that quiet, practiced dismissal that people like her, especially women like her, had grown far too used to navigating. The realization struck deep, more painful than any formal reprimand could deliver. She had asked for nothing more than basic respect, and they had failed to offer even that. The lead attendant, who had been the first to brush her off, sat staring at the closed cabin door, replaying every moment her measured tone, the way she hadn't raised her voice, even when she had every right to. And now, word had spread beyond the aisle. The captain knew. So did the gate agents. A storm of emails had already begun to fly while the aircraft was still ascending. The story would not stay quiet, not this time. And yet, deeper than the panic about consequences, deeper than the fear of public fallout or policy reviews, was something more human: regret. Genuine, heavy, and unshakable. Regret that they hadn't seen her for who she was, not because of her title or recognition, but because she was a person. A woman with a story, with dignity, with the same right to be heard and respected as anyone else. They hadn't known, and yet that was the point: they shouldn't have needed to. The regret was not just that they had misjudged her, but that they had been part of a system that made such misjudgments routine. And now, far above the ground with hours left in the air, there was no apology they could offer that would undo what had already been done. The moment had passed, and with it, their chance to rise above the assumptions they had so easily fallen into. She sat quietly in her seat, eyes fixed on the clouds beyond the window, her silence still more powerful than any confrontation. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard, not anymore. Her presence was enough. Her story would be told, not by her shouting it from the aisle, but by the ripple of reflection and reckoning now coursing through the aircraft's very walls. The flight crew moved with hollow efficiency, offering drinks and forced smiles, their thoughts miles away, wondering how it might have felt to treat her differently, not because she was someone important, but because she was someone human. And as the plane sped through the sky, heading toward its destination, the real journey began within them, a reckoning with the ease of their bias, the danger of assumption, and the painful truth that by the time you realize what someone deserves, it is often far too late to give it. What began as a quiet flight home turned into a watershed moment that would ripple far beyond the walls of the aircraft, sparking a wave of accountability, reflection, and long overdue change. And at the heart of it stood the CEO, a woman who refused to let injustice pass unnoticed. It started with a moment many might have dismissed: a passenger, a woman of color, was treated with thinly veiled disdain and disrespect by a senior airline staff member, her dignity chipped away by the kind of casual prejudice too often ignored. The cabin had fallen into uneasy silence, passengers avoiding eye contact, pretending not to hear, not to feel the tension that hung thick in the air. But the CEO, sitting nearby and witnessing the exchange, knew that silence was complicity. With a quiet but firm voice, she stepped in, not to escalate, but to protect, to uphold the basic truth that every human being deserves respect. Her calm intervention, her refusal to let the incident be swept under the rug, became the spark that ignited something far greater than the moment itself. When the plane landed, she filed a formal report, not as a powerful executive seeking retribution, but as a citizen, as a leader who understood that influence meant responsibility. What followed surprised even her. Word spread quickly, first among passengers, then online. Her story, told with grace and honesty, went viral within hours, capturing the attention of millions across the globe. News outlets picked it up, not just because of her position, but because of the raw truth at its center: that prejudice, no matter how subtle, must be confronted. As public pressure mounted, the airline was forced to respond. What might have once ended in a quiet apology behind closed doors now unfolded in the full light of public scrutiny. The airline issued a statement, then another, until finally, the CEO of the airline reached out personally, not just to apologize, but to ask for guidance. What the woman had done, without anger or theatrics, was force an industry giant to pause and reflect. In boardrooms and break rooms across the country, conversations began to shift. Companies began reviewing their training protocols, discussing bias with more urgency, and inviting voices that had long been silenced to finally be heard. But beyond the headlines and statements was a deeper, more human story. The woman on the flight, once humiliated and unseen, now felt validated, protected, and empowered by the stranger who had stood up for her when no one else did. The CEO, too, was changed. Though she was no stranger to pressure or leadership, this experience reminded her that real leadership doesn't just happen in executive meetings or financial decisions. It happens in the small moments, the quiet decisions to do what is right, even when no one expects it. The story became more than a trending topic, it became a symbol, a case study, a conversation starter in classrooms, HR departments, and family dinners. Some criticized, some defended, but most were moved, not by outrage, but by the clarity of what happened when one person chose to stand up with empathy and courage. Months later, the airline launched a comprehensive reform initiative, not because they had to, but because the world was watching, and more importantly, because they now knew better. The CEO who had spoken out was invited to speak at conferences and summits, not as a corporate leader, but as a human being who used her voice when it mattered most. And yet, she never sought the spotlight. In interviews, she redirected praise to the broader message, that justice begins in the ordinary, and that anyone regardless of title or position can choose to protect dignity when it's threatened. Her act reminded an entire industry that policies and protocols mean nothing without humanity at their core. This single moment aboard a flight didn't just lead to apologies, it led to action. It led to change. And while the media eventually moved on to other headlines, those touched by her courage did not forget. For the woman on the plane, for the passengers who witnessed it, for the employees inspired by it, and for the countless individuals who saw themselves in that story, this moment was a turning point, a rare, beautiful glimpse of justice unfolding in real time. The aftermath wasn't loud or dramatic, it was steady, persistent, and real. In a world often numbed by indifference, her choice echoed with the power of integrity. And in that echo, countless others found their own courage to speak, to stand, and to believe that even a single moment can lead to a more just and compassionate world.